Welcome. Tonight we travel north, far beyond the warm waters of the Mediterranean, to the rugged coastlines and deep fjords of Scandinavia. Here, more than 1,000 years ago, the people known today as the Vikings built villages along cold northern shores where forests, mountains, and icy seas shaped their daily lives. Although Vikings are often remembered for their longships and distant voyages, most Viking men and women lived quiet lives as farmers, craftsmen, traders, and sailors within small communities. Their world was one of wooden longhouses, fishing boats resting along rocky harbors, and fields carved carefully from the northern landscape. Tonight we will slowly explore what daily life may have been like for the people who lived in Viking settlements across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. From the quiet moments before sunrise to the peaceful stillness of night inside the longhouse, we will follow the rhythms of life in the Viking world. Morning in a Viking village. Morning in a Viking settlement often began before the sun fully rose above the mountains or forests. Thin smoke drifted upward from the roofs of wooden longhouses as fires were lit inside the homes. These longhouses served as the center of family life. Built from timber and turf, they protected families from the cold northern winds that swept across the landscape. Inside, the warmth of a central fire slowly filled the room while people prepared for the day ahead. Outside, the village remained quiet for a few moments longer. Soon farmers would begin their work in nearby fields, fishermen would prepare their boats along the shore, and craftsmen would open the doors of their small workshops. Another day of life in the Viking world was about to begin. Viking longhouses. The center of life in a Viking settlement was the longhouse. These large wooden buildings were designed to protect families from the cold Scandinavian climate. Longhouses were usually built using timber frames covered with wooden planks or walls made from wattle and daub. Roofs were often covered with thick layers of turf or straw, which helped insulate the house during harsh winters. Inside, the longhouse was a single large room with a central fire pit used for cooking and warmth. Smoke from the fire escaped through openings in the roof. Along the walls were wooden benches covered with animal skins or wool blankets where family members slept. Livestock such as sheep or goats were sometimes brought inside part of the longhouse during winter to protect them from the cold. Because Viking longhouses could be 20 to 30 meters long, they often housed extended families living together under one roof. Viking farming. Although Vikings are famous for their seafaring expeditions, most Viking people were actually farmers. The climate of Scandinavia made farming difficult, but people adapted to the environment. Farmers grew crops such as barley, oats, and rye, which could survive in cooler northern conditions. Barley was especially important because it was used to make bread, porridge, and ale, a common drink. Viking farmers also raised animals including cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Cattle provided milk used to produce butter and cheese. Sheep were valuable for their wool, which could be spun into thread and woven into cloth. Farms were usually located near small villages and surrounded by fields cleared from forests. Stone walls or wooden fences helped keep animals from wandering into the crops. Viking ships. One of the most famous achievements of Viking culture was their advanced shipbuilding technology. Viking ships were built using a technique known as clinker construction, where wooden planks overlap slightly along the sides of the vessel. This design made ships both flexible and strong enough to handle rough seas. The most famous vessels were longships. These ships were long and narrow with shallow drafts, allowing them to travel both across the open ocean and up shallow rivers. Longships were powered by sails and rows of oars. A large square sail made from wool allowed ships to travel long distances when the wind was favorable. These ships made it possible for Vikings to explore and trade across vast regions including Britain, Ireland, France, Iceland, and even North America. Viking trade. Trade was an important part of Viking life. Viking merchants traveled across Europe and beyond, exchanging goods with many different cultures. Common Viking exports included furs, amber, iron tools, and walrus ivory. In return, Vikings imported goods such as silver coins, glass beads, silk, spices, and jewelry from distant lands. Trade routes extended from Scandinavia to regions as far away as Byzantium and the Middle East. Large trading towns such as Hedeby and Birka became important centers of commerce during the Viking Age. These towns attracted merchants from many different cultures. Trade helped spread ideas, technologies, and cultural influences across the Viking world. Viking clothing. Clothing worn by Vikings was practical and suited for the colder, northern climate. Most garments were made from wool or linen. Men often wore wool trousers along with long tunics that reached down to the thighs or knees. Women typically wore long dresses secured with decorative brooches at the shoulders. Cloaks made from thick wool were worn during colder weather. These cloaks were fastened with metal pins or brooches. Leather shoes or boots protected feet while walking across rough terrain. Archaeological discoveries show that Viking clothing was sometimes dyed using natural plants, producing colors such as blue, red, yellow, and brown. Even though the clothing was practical, many Vikings decorated their garments with jewelry and metal accessories. Viking food. The Viking diet depended largely on farming, fishing, and hunting. Common foods included bread, porridge, fish, meat, dairy products, and vegetables. Barley was one of the most important crops, and was used to make bread and thick grain porridges. Fish from rivers and coastal waters were an important source of protein. Cod, herring, and salmon were commonly eaten. Meat from cattle, pigs, and sheep was sometimes consumed, though it was often reserved for special occasions. Vikings also gathered wild foods such as berries, nuts, and mushrooms from nearby forests. Ale brewed from barley was a common drink served during meals. Meals were often prepared in large pots placed over the central fire inside the longhouse. Viking craftsmen. Viking villages contained skilled craftsmen who produced many essential tools and objects. Blacksmiths worked with iron to create knives, axes, nails, and farming tools. Shipbuilders constructed vessels used for fishing, trade, and exploration. Woodworkers carved household objects, furniture, and decorative items. Jewelry makers crafted brooches, rings, and necklaces using silver, bronze, and sometimes gold. These crafts were important not only for local use but also for trade with distant regions. The craftsmanship of Viking metalworkers and artisans became widely known throughout Europe. Viking exploration. During the Viking Age, Scandinavian sailors traveled farther than many other Europeans of their time. Vikings reached the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of North America. Around the year 1000 CE, a Viking explorer named Leif Erikson led an expedition to a region known as Vinland, believed to be located in present-day Canada. Vikings also traveled east along rivers in Eastern Europe. These journeys eventually connected Scandinavia with major cities such as Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Exploration and trade allowed Vikings to build connections with many distant cultures. Viking religion. Before Christianity spread through Scandinavia, Vikings followed a system of beliefs known as Norse mythology. They believed in many gods and goddesses who influenced the natural world. One of the most important gods was Odin, associated with wisdom and leadership. Another famous god was Thor, the god of thunder, often represented carrying a powerful hammer. The goddess Freya was connected with love, beauty, and fertility. Religious ceremonies sometimes took place at sacred locations such as groves, temples, or natural landmarks. Offerings were made to the gods in hopes of gaining protection or success. These beliefs shaped many aspects of Viking culture and storytelling. Evening in a Viking settlement. As the day slowly came to an end in a Viking village, activity gradually quieted. Farmers returned from the fields while fishermen brought their boats back to shore. Inside the longhouse, the central fire burned brightly as families prepared the evening meal. Food cooked in iron pots filled the room with warmth and the smell of roasted meat or grain porridge. People gathered on benches along the walls, sharing food and conversation. Stories were often told during these evenings. Tales of gods, heroes, and distant voyages passed from one generation to the next. Outside, the cold northern sky slowly filled with stars. The village rested quietly as the night settled across the Scandinavian landscape. Viking settlements and village layout. Most Viking communities were small farming settlements located along coastlines, rivers, or sheltered fjords. These locations provided access to fishing grounds and made it easier for ships to travel between settlements. A typical Viking village might contain only a handful of longhouses spread across the landscape. These buildings were arranged around open areas where animals could be kept and work could take place during the day. The most important building in the settlement was usually the longhouse belonging to the local chieftain, or leader. This structure was often larger than the others and sometimes served as a gathering place where important decisions were discussed. Nearby longhouses housed farming families. Each family maintained small fields where they grew crops and kept livestock. Surrounding the houses were barns, storage sheds, and workshops where craftsmen produced tools and household items. Many settlements also included docks or small harbors where ships could be pulled onto the shore. Because Viking communities relied heavily on both farming and seafaring, the connection between land and water shaped the structure of these villages. The environment of Scandinavia required careful planning for survival. Winters were long and cold, so settlements had to be built in locations that provided shelter from strong winds and easy access to natural resources such as forests and fresh water. Forests provided timber used for building houses, ships, and tools. Rivers and coastal waters provided fish and served as transportation routes. Over time, some Viking settlements grew into larger trading towns. Places like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden became important commercial centers where merchants from many cultures gathered. These towns included marketplaces, docks filled with ships, and large numbers of craftsmen producing goods for trade. Despite these growing urban centers, most Vikings continued to live in smaller rural communities where farming and family life remained central to daily routines. Viking family life. Family was the foundation of Viking society. Households usually consisted of parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives living together under the same roof. The longhouse served as the center of family life. Inside, the central hearth provided warmth and light, while family members worked, ate, and slept in the same shared space. The father typically served as the head of the household, responsible for managing the farm, making decisions, and representing the family in community matters. However, women in Viking society also held significant responsibilities. Women managed the household, prepared food, produced clothing, and supervised many aspects of daily life. They also controlled keys to storage chests where valuable household items were kept, symbolizing their authority within the home. Children began learning practical skills at a young age. Boys often helped their fathers with farming, fishing, and woodworking. Girls learned tasks such as weaving, cooking, and caring for animals. These skills were passed down through generations and ensured that each new generation could maintain the family farm. Family loyalty was extremely important in Viking culture. Strong family ties helped communities survive in a harsh environment where cooperation was necessary for success. Viking law and community assemblies. Although Viking society did not have centralized governments like modern nations, communities still developed systems for resolving disputes and maintaining order. One of the most important institutions was the Thing, a public assembly where free men gathered to discuss laws and settle disagreements. These assemblies were held regularly and served as both political and legal gatherings. At the Thing, community members could present complaints, argue cases, and hear decisions made by local leaders. A speaker known as the law speaker recited laws from memory, since many legal traditions were passed down orally. Punishments for crimes could include fines, compensation payments, or exile from the community. Because Viking settlements were small and closely connected, maintaining cooperation and fairness was important for social stability. Assemblies also provided opportunities for social interaction. People traveling from different villages gathered at these meetings, exchanging news and discussing events affecting the region. In this way, the thing helped maintain order while also strengthening connections between communities. Viking weapons and warfare. Although Vikings are famous for their raids and battles, warfare represented only one aspect of their society. Still, weapons and military equipment were important tools for defense and survival. The most common Viking weapon was the spear. Spears were relatively simple to produce and could be used both for throwing and close combat. Another well-known weapon was the Viking axe, which served both as a tool for woodcutting and a weapon during battles. Axes varied in size, from small hand axes to larger battle axes designed for combat. Swords were also used but were more expensive to produce because they required high-quality metal. As a result, swords were often owned by wealthier warriors or leaders. Viking warriors also carried round wooden shields reinforced with metal bosses at the center. These shields protected fighters and were used in defensive formations during battle. Despite their reputation as fierce raiders, Vikings spent most of their lives engaged in farming, trade, and family life rather than warfare.
Viking trade routes and global connections. Viking traders traveled across a vast network of routes connecting Scandinavia with many other regions. To the west, Viking ships sailed to the British Isles, Ireland, and the coast of France. To the east, Scandinavian traders navigated rivers that stretched deep into Eastern Europe. These river routes eventually connected Viking merchants with the powerful city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. Trade goods moved along these routes in both directions. Vikings exported items such as furs, amber, walrus ivory, and iron tools. In return, they imported silver coins, silk fabrics, glassware, spices, and jewelry. The flow of silver into Scandinavia became especially important. Many Viking hoards discovered by archaeologists contain large collections of foreign silver coins. These discoveries reveal how extensive Viking trade networks had become during the Viking Age. Trade allowed Vikings to interact with many cultures and helped spread new technologies and ideas throughout Europe. Night in the Viking world. As evening settled over a Viking settlement, daily activities slowly faded. Farmers returned from their fields while fishermen pulled their boats onto the shore. Inside the longhouse, the central hearth became the focus of evening life. Family members gathered around the fire while meals were prepared. Large iron pots hung above the flames as food slowly cooked. After eating, people often spent time talking or listening to stories. Storytelling played an important role in Viking culture. Tales about gods, heroes, and legendary voyages were shared across generations. These stories later became part of the Norse sagas, written centuries afterward. Outside, the northern landscape grew quiet beneath the night sky. The stars shone brightly over the fjords and forests of Scandinavia. For a few peaceful hours, the village rested before another day of work began. Viking fishing. Fishing was one of the most important daily activities for many Viking communities. Scandinavia is surrounded by cold northern seas rich with marine life. Viking fishermen used small wooden boats to travel short distances from shore. They caught fish using nets, hooks, and traps. Common fish included cod, herring, salmon, and mackerel. Fish could be eaten fresh, but it was often preserved so it could last through the winter months. Drying and salting fish allowed it to be stored for long periods. Dried cod became one of the most important food supplies for many Viking settlements. Fishing not only provided food but also created products that could be traded with other regions. Viking hunting. In addition to farming and fishing, Vikings also relied on hunting. The forests of Scandinavia contained animals such as deer, elk, wild boar, and bears. Hunters used bows, spears, and traps to capture animals. Animal hides were extremely valuable because they could be used to produce clothing, blankets, and leather goods. Furs were also an important trade item. Viking traders often exported furs from northern animals such as foxes, martens, and beavers. Hunting required knowledge of animal behavior and the landscape. These skills were passed down from one generation to the next. Viking blacksmiths. Blacksmiths played a critical role in Viking communities. They worked with iron to create tools, weapons, and everyday objects needed for daily life. Iron ore was found in parts of Scandinavia and could be smelted in small furnaces. The blacksmith heated iron in a forge and shaped it using hammers and anvils. Tools such as axes, knives, farming equipment, nails, and rivets were produced this way. Shipbuilding also depended on blacksmiths to create metal parts used in constructing longships. Because iron tools were essential for both farming and travel, the blacksmith's workshop was one of the most important places in the village. Viking jewelry and decoration. Vikings valued decorative objects and personal ornaments. Men and women often wore brooches, arm rings, necklaces, and beads. These items were made from materials such as bronze, silver, gold, glass, and amber. Amber was especially prized because it could be found along the Baltic Sea. Jewelry was not only decorative but sometimes served as a form of portable wealth. Silver arm rings could be cut into smaller pieces and used for trade. Many Viking artifacts discovered by archaeologists include finely crafted jewelry showing the artistic skill of Viking craftsmen. Viking storytelling and sagas. Storytelling played a central role in Viking culture. During long winter evenings, families gathered inside longhouses where stories were told around the fire. These stories included legends about gods, heroes, and famous explorers. Many stories were later written down in texts known as sagas. The sagas recorded events from the Viking Age and preserved important traditions. They described voyages across the sea, family conflicts, and heroic adventures. Because Viking culture relied heavily on oral storytelling, skilled storytellers were highly respected members of society. Viking blacksmiths. Blacksmiths played a critical role in Viking communities. They worked with iron to create tools, weapons, and everyday objects needed for daily life. Iron ore was found in parts of Scandinavia and could be smelted in small furnaces. The blacksmith heated iron in a forge and shaped it using hammers and anvils. Tools such as axes, knives, farming equipment, nails, and rivets were produced this way. Shipbuilding also depended on blacksmiths to create metal parts used in constructing longships. Because iron tools were essential for both farming and travel, the blacksmith's workshop was one of the most important places in the village. Viking jewelry and decoration. Vikings valued decorative objects and personal ornaments. Men and women often wore brooches, arm rings, necklaces, and beads. These items were made from materials such as bronze, silver, gold, glass, and amber. Amber was especially prized because it could be found along the Baltic Sea. Jewelry was not only decorative but sometimes served as a form of portable wealth. Silver arm rings could be cut into smaller pieces and used for trade. Many Viking artifacts discovered by archaeologists include finely crafted jewelry showing the artistic skill of Viking craftsmen. Viking storytelling and sagas. Storytelling played a central role in Viking culture. During long winter evenings, families gathered inside longhouses where stories were told around the fire. These stories included legends about gods, heroes, and famous explorers. Many stories were later written down in texts known as sagas. The sagas recorded events from the Viking Age and preserved important traditions. They described voyages across the sea, family conflicts, and heroic adventures. Because Viking culture relied heavily on oral storytelling, skilled storytellers were highly respected members of society. Viking navigation skills. Navigating across the northern seas required skill and experience. Viking sailors used several methods to determine direction. They watched the sun's position during the day and observed stars at night. Birds and ocean currents could also provide clues about nearby land. Some historians believe Vikings used special crystals known as sunstones that helped locate the sun even on cloudy days. These navigation skills allowed Viking ships to travel across vast distances of open water. Evening in the Viking longhouse. As the sun set over the Scandinavian landscape, activity in the village gradually slowed. Farmers returned from the fields while fishermen secured their boats. Inside the longhouse, the central fire burned brightly. Large wooden beams supported the roof while smoke drifted upward toward vents in the ceiling. Family members gathered on benches along the walls. Meals of bread, fish, meat, and porridge were shared. After eating, people often spent time repairing tools, weaving cloth, or telling stories. Outside, the northern sky slowly filled with stars. The village rested quietly beneath the cold night sky before another day began. Viking agriculture and seasonal work. Viking farming followed the rhythm of the seasons. Spring was the time when fields were prepared and crops were planted. Farmers used simple tools such as wooden plows pulled by oxen to turn the soil. Barley, oats, and rye were the most common grains grown in Scandinavia. These crops were hardy enough to survive the cooler northern climate. During the summer months, farmers cared for the crops while also tending livestock. Animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs needed constant attention. Autumn was the harvest season. Families worked together to gather grain, store food, and prepare supplies for the long winter months ahead. Winter was quieter in terms of farming, but people still had work to do inside their homes. Tools were repaired, clothing was produced, and preserved food was carefully managed so it would last until spring. Viking winter life. Winter in Scandinavia could be long and difficult. Snow covered the ground and daylight hours became much shorter. Because farming was impossible during this time, much of daily life moved indoors. Inside the longhouse, the central fire provided warmth and light. Families spent time preparing food, weaving cloth, repairing tools, and telling stories. Winter evenings were also a time for social gatherings. Neighbors sometimes visited one another to share meals and stories. Although winter could be harsh, it also allowed communities time to rest after the busy farming season. Viking woodworking. Woodworking was one of the most important skills in Viking society. Forests across Scandinavia provided large amounts of timber. This wood was used to build homes, ships, tools, furniture, and household objects. Skilled woodworkers carved everything from spoons and bowls to large structural beams used in longhouses. Wood was also used to create shields and many parts of Viking ships. Because wood was so widely available, it became one of the most commonly used materials in Viking craftsmanship. Many wooden artifacts discovered by archaeologists show detailed carvings and decorative designs. Viking women and their roles. Women played essential roles in Viking society. Inside the household, women managed daily domestic activities. They prepared meals, produced clothing, and supervised food storage. Women were also responsible for spinning wool and weaving cloth used to make garments. In addition to domestic responsibilities, women sometimes helped manage farms and livestock. Historical evidence suggests that Viking women could also own property and manage households when their husbands were away. Jewelry such as oval brooches worn on dresses often symbolized a woman's status within the household. These responsibilities made women central to the stability of Viking communities. Viking children. Children in Viking society began learning skills at a young age. Boys often learned farming, fishing, and woodworking by helping their fathers or other adult men in the community. Girls learned tasks such as cooking, weaving, and caring for animals. Children also played games and participated in physical activities that helped develop strength and coordination. Because survival in Viking society depended on practical skills, education was often hands-on and focused on everyday work. As children grew older, they gradually took on greater responsibilities within the family. Viking trade centers. Some Viking settlements grew into major trade centers. Two of the most famous were Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden. These towns became busy marketplaces where merchants from many regions gathered. Archaeological discoveries at these sites have uncovered goods from across Europe and even parts of Asia. Glass beads, silver coins, silk fabrics, and metal objects have all been found in these trading towns. These discoveries show that Viking trade networks stretched far beyond Scandinavia. Trade helped connect Viking communities with distant cultures and economies. Viking tools and everyday objects. Daily life in Viking settlements relied on a wide variety of tools. Farmers used axes, hoes, sickles, and wooden plows to work the land. Knives were one of the most common personal tools carried by both men and women. They were used for preparing food, carving wood, and many other daily tasks. Other common objects included wooden buckets, clay cooking pots, and iron cauldrons. These tools and objects helped make daily work more efficient. Many Viking tools discovered by archaeologists show signs of heavy use, reflecting the demanding nature of daily life. Viking festivals and gatherings. Despite the hard work required for survival, Vikings also celebrated festivals throughout the year. These gatherings often occurred during important seasonal moments such as the winter solstice or harvest. Feasts were prepared with large amounts of food and drink. Meat, bread, ale, and other foods were shared among the community. Music, storytelling, and competitions sometimes accompanied these celebrations. These gatherings helped strengthen social bonds between families and villages. They also provided moments of relaxation during the demanding cycles of work. Viking beliefs about the afterlife. Viking mythology included detailed ideas about life after death. Warriors who died bravely in battle were believed to be welcomed into Valhalla, a great hall ruled by the god Odin. Other individuals might enter Folkvangr, a realm associated with the goddess Freyja. These beliefs were closely connected with ideas about honor and courage. Stories about these afterlife realms were told in myths and poems that became part of Viking cultural tradition. These beliefs influenced burial practices and the way Vikings viewed life and death. A quiet Viking night. As night settles over the Scandinavian landscape, Viking villages grow calm. The sounds of daily work fade as families gather inside their longhouses. The central hearth glows softly, filling the room with warmth. Outside, the cold northern air moves gently across fields and forests. Above the village, the sky fills with bright stars. Without artificial light, the night sky appears incredibly clear. For a few peaceful hours, the Viking world rests before the first light of morning returns. Viking longship construction. Building a Viking longship required skill and careful craftsmanship. Shipbuilders began by selecting strong oak trees from nearby forests. The wood was shaped into planks that formed the hull of the ship. Viking ships used a technique called clinker building, where planks overlapped each other along the sides of the vessel. Iron rivets were used to hold these planks together. This design made the ships both strong and flexible, allowing them to move through rough waves without breaking. Longships were usually between 20 and 30 meters long, and could carry dozens of sailors. A large square sail made from wool allowed the ship to travel long distances when winds were favorable. Rows of oars were used when wind was weak, or when maneuvering near shore. These ships were among the most advanced vessels of their time. Viking harbors and coastal settlements. Many Viking villages were built near sheltered coastal areas. Natural harbors provided protection from strong winds and waves. Ships could be pulled onto beaches or tied to simple wooden docks. These harbors became centers of activity.
Fishermen prepared their boats early in the morning before heading out to sea. Merchants loaded cargo onto ships that would travel to distant markets. Travelers arriving from other settlements brought news and goods from across the Viking world. Because sea travel was often easier than traveling across mountains and forests, coastal settlements played an important role in Viking society. Viking farming tools. Farming required a variety of tools that helped Vikings cultivate their land. Axes were used to clear forests and prepare farmland. Wooden plows pulled by oxen helped turn the soil for planting crops. Sickles were used to harvest grain during autumn. Other tools such as spades, rakes, and wooden hoes helped farmers maintain their fields. These tools were usually made from wood with iron blades produced by blacksmiths. Because tools were valuable, they were carefully repaired when damaged. Maintaining these tools was essential for successful harvests. Viking bread and grain foods. Grain formed a major part of the Viking diet. Barley was the most widely grown crop in Scandinavia. It was used to produce bread, porridge, and ale. Grain was ground into flour using stone querns. These grinding stones were operated by hand and allowed flour to be produced for cooking. Bread was often flat and dense compared to modern loaves. Porridge made from boiled grain was another common meal. These foods provided energy needed for the physical labor required in Viking life. Viking ale brewing. Ale was one of the most common drinks in Viking society. It was brewed using barley and water. The brewing process involved soaking grain, allowing it to ferment, and producing a mildly alcoholic drink. Ale was often safer to drink than untreated water and became a regular part of daily meals. Large gatherings and celebrations sometimes included large quantities of ale served during feasts. Brewing ale was an important household skill, often managed by women within the household. Viking animal husbandry. Animals played an essential role in Viking farming communities. Cattle provided milk used to make butter and cheese. Sheep provided wool used to produce clothing and textiles. Goats were valued for both milk and meat. Pigs were raised for meat and could feed on forest resources such as acorns. Animals were often kept in barns or brought inside longhouses during harsh winters. Caring for livestock required daily attention and was an important responsibility for farming families. Viking trade with the East. Viking traders traveled far beyond Scandinavia. Using rivers that flowed through Eastern Europe, they reached large cities connected to the Byzantine Empire. Some Vikings eventually served as elite guards for Byzantine emperors. These warriors became known as the Varangian Guard. Trade along these eastern routes brought large quantities of silver coins into Scandinavia. These coins have been discovered in Viking hoards buried across northern Europe. This trade network shows how far Viking influence extended during the Viking Age. Viking runestones. Runestones were large stones carved with inscriptions using the runic alphabet. These stones were often raised to honor important individuals or commemorate events. Runestones sometimes described voyages, battles, or family achievements. They were placed along roads, near bridges, or in gathering places where travelers could see them. Many runestones discovered in Scandinavia date from the Viking Age. They provide valuable information about Viking history and language. Viking games and recreation. Although Viking life involved hard work, people also enjoyed leisure activities. Board games were popular forms of entertainment. One game known as Nafadafel involved strategic movement of pieces across a board. Athletic contests such as wrestling, swimming, and running were also common. These activities helped develop strength and endurance. Children and adults alike participated in these games during gatherings and festivals. Evening across the Viking landscape. As evening approached in Viking settlements, the pace of activity slowed. Farmers returned from their fields while fishermen secured their boats along the shore. Smoke rose from longhouses as fires were prepared for cooking. Families gathered inside to share food and conversation.
Outside, the northern sky darkened as stars appeared above the forests and fjords. The village grew quiet as people rested before another day of work began. Viking markets and trade gatherings. Markets were important events in the Viking world. Although many Viking communities were small farming villages, larger trading centers developed where merchants from many regions gathered. These markets often took place in towns such as Hedeby, Kaupang, and Birka. Merchants arrived by ship carrying goods from distant lands. Furs, amber, iron tools, and walrus ivory were common Viking exports. In return, traders brought items such as silver coins, glass beads, silk, spices, and jewelry. These markets allowed Viking communities to access goods that could not be produced locally. They also became places where news and stories traveled between different regions of Europe. Trade gatherings often lasted several days and attracted large crowds. Viking boats, for fishing and travel. Not every Viking ship was a large longship used for long voyages. Many smaller boats were used for everyday travel and fishing. These vessels were usually built using the same clinker construction method as longships but were much smaller. Small fishing boats allowed Vikings to travel along coastlines and rivers while catching fish for food. Because Scandinavia is filled with fjords, lakes, and rivers, boats became essential for transportation. Traveling by water was often easier than crossing mountains and forests on foot. As a result, boats were a common sight in Viking settlements near the coast. Viking wood carving. Wood carving was a highly developed skill in Viking society. Because forests were abundant in Scandinavia, wood became one of the most widely used materials. Craftsmen carved wooden bowls, cups, spoons, furniture, and decorative objects. Many Viking ships were decorated with carved designs along their bows and sterns. These carvings sometimes featured animal shapes or complex patterns. Wood was also used to create everyday household items that were both functional and artistic. Archaeologists have discovered many examples of Viking wood carving that show remarkable detail and craftsmanship. Viking textiles and weaving. Producing clothing and textiles required many hours of work. Viking women often spun wool using tools called spindles. The wool was twisted into thread that could then be woven into cloth. Large upright looms were used to weave fabric. This cloth was used to create tunics, cloaks, and blankets. Dyeing techniques allowed textiles to be colored using natural materials such as plants and minerals. Blue, red, yellow, and brown dyes were produced from these natural sources. Textile production was one of the most important household tasks in Viking communities. Viking navigation along the coast. Most Viking voyages followed coastlines whenever possible. By staying close to land, sailors could easily identify landmarks and avoid becoming lost. Cliffs, islands, and mountains served as natural navigation markers. If storms appeared, ships could quickly seek shelter in nearby harbors or bays. Sailors also watched the behavior of seabirds, which often indicated that land was nearby. This combination of observation and experience allowed Viking sailors to travel safely across long distances. Viking seasonal festivals. Festivals were important social events in Viking communities. These gatherings often occurred during significant moments of the year such as the winter solstice or the end of the harvest season. Large feasts were prepared with meat, bread, fish, and ale. Music, storytelling, and games often accompanied these celebrations. Festivals allowed communities to relax and celebrate after long periods of work. They also reinforced social bonds between families and neighboring villages. Viking northern landscapes. The landscapes of Scandinavia shaped many aspects of Viking life. Tall mountains, deep fjords, dense forests, and rocky coastlines formed the environment in which Viking communities developed. These landscapes influenced settlement locations, farming practices, and travel routes. Fjords provided sheltered waterways that allowed ships to travel inland from the sea. Forests supplied timber used for building houses, ships, and tools. Despite the harsh climate, Vikings adapted successfully to these environments. Their ability to navigate and utilize these landscapes helped them expand across large parts of Europe. A calm Viking night. As night settles across a Viking settlement, the sounds of work slowly fade. Fires glow inside longhouses while families gather together after the day's labor. Outside, the cold northern air moves quietly across the fields and forests. Ships rest along the shoreline while waves gently touch the docks. Above the village, the sky fills with stars that shine brightly in the dark Scandinavian night. For a few peaceful hours, the Viking world rests before the next day begins. Viking farming communities. Most Vikings lived in small farming communities rather than large cities. These settlements were spread across the landscapes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Families worked together to cultivate small fields and raise livestock. Because the growing season in Scandinavia was short, farmers needed to work efficiently during spring and summer. Communities often shared responsibilities such as maintaining fences, clearing land, and caring for animals. Neighboring farms supported each other during busy times such as planting and harvest. This cooperation helped communities survive in a challenging northern environment. Viking tools made from iron. Iron played an essential role in Viking daily life. Blacksmiths heated iron in small furnaces and shaped it into useful tools. Axes were among the most important tools produced. They were used for chopping wood, building houses, constructing ships, and clearing farmland. Other tools included knives, chisels, hammers, and farming implements. Because iron tools were valuable, they were carefully maintained and repaired when necessary. The availability of iron tools helped Vikings build strong ships and durable structures. Viking storage and food preservation. Preparing food for winter required careful planning. During the warmer months, Vikings preserved large quantities of food so it would last through the cold season. Fish and meat were often dried or smoked. Salt was sometimes used to preserve food for longer periods. Grain was stored in wooden containers or small storage buildings. Dairy products such as cheese and butter could also be stored for later use. These preservation methods ensured that Viking families had enough food to survive the winter months. Viking travel by river. Rivers played an important role in Viking exploration and trade. In Eastern Europe, Vikings traveled along river systems that connected the Baltic Sea to distant regions. Ships could be rowed upstream or carried over short stretches of land between rivers. These river routes eventually connected Scandinavia to major trade centers such as Constantinople. Because rivers extended deep into the interior of Europe, they became valuable trade highways for Viking merchants. Viking legends and heroic tales. Stories about heroes and legendary events were an important part of Viking culture. These tales were shared through oral storytelling during gatherings and long winter evenings. Stories described powerful gods, brave warriors, and long sea voyages. Some of these stories were later written down as Norse sagas in medieval Iceland. These sagas preserved details about Viking history, family lineages, and cultural traditions. Through storytelling, Viking communities passed down knowledge and values from one generation to the next. The northern sky above Viking lands. At night, the sky above Scandinavia appeared incredibly clear. Without artificial lighting, the stars were bright and easy to see across the northern landscape. Sailors often relied on these stars when traveling across the sea. Farmers and travelers also observed the sky to track the changing seasons. The long winter nights sometimes brought views of the aurora borealis, also known as the northern lights. These shimmering lights moving across the sky must have been an unforgettable sight for the people living in Viking lands. Viking long-distance voyages. Some Viking expeditions involved journeys across great distances. Using their longships, Viking sailors traveled far beyond Scandinavia. They reached the coasts of England, Ireland, and Scotland, where they traded, settled, and sometimes raided. Other voyages took them south toward France and the Mediterranean Sea. To the east, Viking traders traveled through river routes in Eastern Europe that connected to large cities of the Byzantine Empire. These long-distance voyages required careful planning and experienced sailors. Crews needed to bring food, water, tools, and spare equipment for their journeys. Although these voyages are often remembered for raids and battles, many were actually focused on trade and exploration. Viking metalwork. Metalworking was an advanced craft in Viking society. Blacksmiths produced tools, weapons, and decorative objects using iron, bronze, and sometimes silver. Weapons such as swords, axes, and spearheads required careful shaping and heating of metal. Decorative metal objects were also produced. Brooches, rings, and pendants often included detailed designs inspired by animals or mythological figures. These artistic patterns became a recognizable feature of Viking craftsmanship. Metal objects were valuable possessions that could be passed down through generations. Viking ships resting at harbor. As evening approached in coastal Viking settlements, ships returned from their journeys. Fishing boats arrived first, bringing the day's catch back to shore. Merchant vessels followed, carrying goods from distant markets. Longships were pulled onto beaches or tied to wooden docks. Sailors secured ropes and unloaded cargo before the darkness of night arrived. The harbor gradually became quiet as the final preparations for the evening were completed. Ships rested beside the shoreline while the village prepared for the night ahead. The calm before morning. As the night deepens across the Scandinavian landscape, Viking settlements grow quiet. Inside longhouses, families settle near the warmth of the hearth. The fires burn low while the final conversations of the evening fade. Outside, forests and fjords lie still beneath the cold northern sky. Stars shine clearly across the darkness. Soon the first light of dawn will appear once again. Farmers will return to their fields, fishermen will prepare their boats, and the rhythms of daily life will begin again. Viking social classes. Viking society was organized into several social groups that shaped daily life in Scandinavia. At the top of society were jarls, the noble leaders and chieftains who controlled land and commanded warriors. Jarls often owned large farms and held authority over surrounding communities. Below them were the carls, who made up the majority of Viking society. Carls were free men and women who worked as farmers, craftsmen, traders, and shipbuilders. They owned land, participated in community assemblies, and formed the backbone of Viking communities. At the bottom of the social structure were thralls, who were enslaved individuals captured during raids or born into slavery. Thralls performed heavy labors such as farming, construction, and domestic work. Although this hierarchy existed, Viking society was somewhat flexible compared to later feudal systems. Successful traders or warriors could sometimes gain wealth and improve their status. These social structures shaped the relationships between people in Viking settlements and influenced how communities were organized. Viking ship navigation and ocean knowledge. Viking sailors possessed impressive knowledge of the sea and its patterns. Without modern maps or navigation instruments, they relied on observation and experience. Sailors watched the sun's position during the day and the stars at night to determine direction. They also studied ocean currents, wind patterns, and the movement of seabirds. Birds often indicated that land was nearby, helping sailors locate coastlines. Some historians believe Vikings may have used special crystals known as sunstones to locate the sun through clouds. These navigation techniques allowed Viking ships to travel across the North Atlantic and explore distant lands. Their understanding of the sea made them some of the most skilled sailors of the early medieval world. Viking crafts and artistic design. Viking craftsmen produced many objects that combined practical function with artistic decoration. Metalworkers created weapons, tools, and jewelry using techniques that required great skill. Woodcarvers decorated ships, furniture, and household items with intricate designs. These patterns often included interwoven animals, serpents, and geometric shapes. This distinctive artistic style is sometimes called the Norse animal style. Decorative art appeared on brooches, belt buckles, weapons, and even stone monuments. These artistic traditions reflected both cultural identity and the creativity of Viking craftsmen. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the impressive craftsmanship of Viking artisans. Viking trade goods. The Viking economy depended heavily on trade across large regions. Merchants transported goods between Scandinavia and many other parts of Europe. Some of the most valuable Viking exports included furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron tools, and timber. Furs from northern animals such as foxes and martens were highly prized in warmer regions. Amber from the Baltic Sea was used to make jewelry and decorative objects. In return, Vikings imported silver coins, silk fabrics, glassware, spices, and precious metals. Many Viking hoards discovered by archaeologists contain large collections of foreign silver coins, demonstrating the importance of trade. These trading activities connected Viking settlements to a wide network of cultures across Europe and Asia. Viking seasonal travel and exploration. The timing of Viking voyages depended greatly on the seasons. Most long-distance expeditions took place during the spring and summer months, when weather conditions were calmer and daylight hours were longer. During winter, travel across the open sea was much more dangerous. As a result, winter months were usually spent at home repairing ships, preparing tools, and planning future voyages. When spring arrived, ships were launched again and crews prepared for new journeys. These seasonal cycles shaped the rhythm of exploration, trade, and travel throughout the Viking world. The northern landscapes of the Viking world. The landscapes of Scandinavia played a powerful role in shaping Viking life. Norway's coastline was filled with deep fjords, narrow waterways surrounded by steep cliffs. Sweden contained large forests and lakes that supported farming and hunting. Denmark's flatter lands allowed for more extensive agriculture. These varied environments influenced where settlements were built and how people lived. Forests provided timber for building ships and houses. Rivers and fjords served as transportation routes. Despite the challenges of cold winters and rugged terrain, Viking communities adapted successfully to these northern landscapes. Their ability to use these environments helped them expand across much of Europe during the Viking Age.
Thank you for joining this relaxing journey into the world of the Vikings. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration of history, make sure to subscribe to Dreamtime History for more calm stories from the past designed to help you relax and fall asleep. From ancient civilizations to medieval life and distant cultures, there are many more quiet journeys through history still ahead. For now, rest well, and thank you for watching.